Welcome to the next question. I'm Jenny.
I'm Austin.
I'm Chi-Chi.
So ladies, today we are joined yet again by the lovely Andre Henry. So you might remember him from last week's episode, but he's with us. We already gave you his credentials, but he basically, we've labeled him a historian. He is an artist, he's a writer, he's a musician. He has a deep passion for racial justice and social change. And he just had so much good stuff that we literally sat just kind of in awe and just were drinking from the fire hose of his just like brilliance and wealth of knowledge. So we just decided, instead of taking out so much good stuff, we wanted to just live in it a little bit longer. So he's with us again.
I have great respect for academics, but I am so impressed that Andre Henry is just self-taught. Like he taught us so much just because of his own commitment to reading and learning. And so this was an amazing conversation. In some ways, because he's not an academic, he's one of us.
Yes.
Yeah, I felt inspired by it. I mean, I went home and I was like, okay, I need to give myself my own curriculum here so I can get on his level, you know? So yeah, I'm inspired to learn more by, his life and what he's doing. And I'm so excited that we are able to divide this up into 2 episodes and get this information out there.
Same.
All right, should we do it?
Yeah. All right. It's time for the next question. I remember reading in, I was a psychology major in college, and we did those, there was this experiment or whatever where they basically divided up a group of people and said you're the prisoners and you're the prison guards. And within a day, I mean, it was hours. Yeah, the prisoners were the prison guards were abusing the prisoners that weren't actually prisoners. And it's just they're like, what? I was just doing what I was told. And that's, I think you're hearing about when you look at the Holocaust, all these Nazis were I was just following orders. I don't know. And I feel like that's what you're hearing at the border even now of I'm just doing what I'm told. How do you disrupt that? Is that the hearts and minds? How do you, because I'm not at the border to sign me up and maybe I'll go try to infiltrate or something. But yeah, how do we resist this blind allegiance to, you've been tasked with keeping, being the one in charge?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, obedience is at the heart of political power, is what Gene Sharp would say, right? And that's exactly what you're hitting on, is that. And the question is, well, why do people obey?
Right.
Why do people go along with why do people go with the oppressive flow, is what I'm gonna say. And there are many reasons why. Some is because it's just habit. It's just what we've always done.
You've never resisted this, so why start now?
We talked about growing up in the South.
Right, yeah.
It's just,
yeah.
Why do we go along with that? Well, that's all we know.
Yeah.
Right? Some feel that they have a moral obligation to do what they are told. Right.
Right.
Now, the civil rights movement undermined that by breaking the law and getting arrested.
The moral choice. That's right. That's right.
They flipped that on its head.
That's right.
And showed that criminality.
Right.
Showed that criminality was a white construct.
That's right.
At the time,
That's right.
So. But then you have other people who psychologically identify with the ruler. They see themselves as an extension of the state, and they see themselves in the ruler, and so whatever they perceive as success for the ruler is success for them. And so a part of this is understanding all these different reasons, and then you can think strategically, well, how do you disrupt this? The question is that the hearts and minds part? So there's a guy named Jonathan Smucker. I'm gonna keep dropping books, right? This is all I do is just read. Because I just love this idea of revolution and social change. And so Jonathan Smucker talks about, we are in a hegemonic contest, right? A struggle for power. And he would cut that into 2 parts. He says part of it is the institutional contest. And that's a lot what we're talking about when we talk about systems and structures and, policy, anti-racist policy. But the other part of that is the symbolic contest, which is basically talking about our common sense. It's about the way that we think, the way that we imagine the world, the stories that we tell ourselves, the mythologies that we believe in. That's a part of it too. And so, yes, there is a part of that that does need to be disrupted. And there are many ways. Some of that is through some of our symbolic actions, Did you see the action that these kids, I can't remember where in Europe, it's a country in Europe, but they were standing and there was this frame that had nooses hanging from it and they had nooses around their necks and they were standing on top of blocks of ice.
Wow.
To say to us, look at what's happening to this world.
Yeah.
Look at what's happening to this planet.
Wow.
That's a potent image, right?
Yep.
The civil rights movement, they did this through those demonstrations.
That's right.
It was
Using media.
the freedom rides and using freedom, courting white supremacist violence, but making sure the cameras were rolling so that white America could see, and it disrupted that common sense. That is how they engaged in that symbolic contest. So there are many different ways, but a part of it has to do with our analysis, is sitting down and thinking through, why do these people obey? Why do they do? I want to give one more example. During the Serbian nonviolent revolution, there was this one. So first off, they were protesting the dictator Slobodan Milosevic. They wanted to take down the dictator. And it was organized by college students. And so there were many arrests. The police brutality is a global thing. And so the police would arrest these activists and beat them up. But Sergej Popovic, who was one of the leaders, wrote in his book, Blueprint for Revolution, he wrote about this one guard that was infamous for beating up these activist kids. He had a reputation, people knew about him, and he seemed to take pride in doing it. And so what they did was they created posters of this man's face, and they posted it around town saying, why is he beating our children? You see how they shift the frame to not just, fight the power, but they appealed to the parents and grandparents. Now, all of a sudden, that guy's reputation it's plummeting among his peers.
That's right.
And it changed his attitude.
Let's talk about, because I feel like media today and the display of death of Black and brown bodies. We live in a new age now where we start to see it. This has been happening for centuries, but now we have people on their phones, they can show this. And I thought that this would be a turning point for us. We would be able to see it. White, brown, Black, everybody can see this and say, this is not, and yet nothing is happening. And to the point where, the people who even perpetuate this, nothing happened. And I know you've talked about, you seeing Philando Castile die and that video and how it kind of, it was a turning point for you. Absolutely. I don't understand it anymore. Do you think we're just so numb to it now, or we don't even, I feel like that's where it is. I won't watch the videos. I won't, because at first I was I'm glad we're showing this because people need to see this. And then after, you lose count and it's okay, are we just watching this because, now we're just desensitized.
What are we feeding at this point?
Right. Yeah. So I guess, my question is, so you're talking about those powerful images and how they change things, but are we so far gone? That's not even, this won't turn our hearts towards, exactly. And now we're just again.
There are a couple things I think that are really important to think about that. First off, it's it's a very high bar to say that it's a very high bar for us to depend on these images of Black death to move people. So I want to be careful, first off, to not even insinuate that like it should take that.
Right. Oh, I totally.
Which I know that you're not
Right,
saying, but
right.
it's like,
Right, that's-
because sometimes, people are like, well, Emmett Till's open casket funeral really changed things, and it did.
Yeah.
Now, let's be real. Emmett Till's open casket funeral did not just move white people.
That's right.
Right.
There were a lot of black people that were inactive.
I would argue that it did more to move
The black community.
community
Yeah.
than it did
His
to...
own mother said, when that happened,
right.
Right.
I felt like, when I heard about what was happening in the South,
That's right.
I thought that's their problem. It's got nothing to do with me.
Yep.
That's what his mom said.
Yeah.
Those kinds of images can move people.
Right.
It's just a high bar. What we know is that it's not moving everyone, but it never did.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
It never did.
Right.
So I don't know what it really says about us as a country that's different from what it has said before,
Yeah.
right? What it does make me think of is that allies, movement activity, or movement participants, they exist on a spectrum, And so the key is in building a movement is to target the right people. And most of those people, they say, are in the middle. Most of those people are the oblivious neutrals.
Right, right. Are those the people we have to get?
They say that's where the numbers are.
Right.
That's where they say is, okay, so here's a spectrum of allies. Do you know this already? So on the one extreme, you have the leading activists.
Right.
On the opposite extreme, you have Richard Spencer.
Right.
And the Klansman.
Actively working towards...
Actively working for racist progress.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
The light show was probably his.
Exactly. So yes. All right, so let's move from the leading racists to the other side. So those are your active opposers.
Right.
Then a click over, you have your passive opposers. They disagree with you. They're just not doing anything about it, really.
Right. I feel like we've got a lot of those
Yeah,
right now.
yeah.
They're not gonna help you.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not gonna actively stand against you.
Right.
But they probably think you shouldn't be doing what you're doing anyway.
Right.
And they're not gonna say anything, right?
Right.
Now, let's go back. Leading racists, don't bother with them.
Right.
You're not gonna win them over. Actually, when I was 9 or 10 or something, I don't remember. I was young, probably not that young. I remember coming across this very racist website, and he was using like the Bible to talk about how black people are inferior, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, oh, this poor guy, he can't read the Bible correctly. So I emailed him.
Wait, how old were you?
I don't remember. I was young.
Oh my gosh.
I was young and just thought, oh my gosh,
This poor soul.
poor soul.
What needs to help him?
It's like, poor soul has come down with the racism. So we have to save him. And so he and I went back and forth for like months.
Wow.
Trying
He's like
to,
a grown up.
Yeah, he's an adult man. He didn't know how young
Right.
I was, so
Sure.
but apparently he couldn't tell. So I don't know what that.
My peer is emailing me.
Yes. But you're making some good arguments. But that's all you're gonna do
Right,
with a leading
right.
racist. You're gonna go back and forth. That person is probably not movable.
Yeah.
All right, now let's go back another click. These are the passive opposers. They're very hard to win. But if you do win them, they can be your most potent witnesses to what you're talking about afterward, because they'll say, listen,
Yeah.
I used to be a Klansman.
Right?
I used to believe this stuff, but now I'm different. That's a lot of work though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The gains are, I mean, it's debatable. The gains are high, but so is the effort. Very, very high. One more click over. These are the neutrals. This is the biggest wedge on the spectrum. This is where they say the numbers are.
Yeah.
They're not as much work as these others. What they need is information. They don't know what to believe. They haven't really come down either way. So if you can present it to them and help them know that it's true and be compelling and all that kind of thing, they're likely to move to the passive supporter space. Your passive supporters are the ones who go, these are most of your white liberals. Right. I agree with you.
Was that your white liberal voice?
Yes.
Good. If I close my eyes.
I so agree with you. I'm doing nothing. Right? Oh, that is a terrible thing that happened to you. All right, you gonna come to the march? I've got to make avocado toast or whatever we do. Whatever. I don't know what y'all do. But these are the people that I'm really working on with my work, with Hope and Hard Pills, are the people who say, I care. I want to do something. I don't know what to do. I'm like, let me tell you about Gene Sharp. Let me tell you about Sergei Popovich. Let me tell you about the Civil Rights Movement. So that you can give them a step. And then you're back into the active supporter space. I think that a lot of this has to do with targeting the right people. We're not going to get everyone. Right. We don't need everyone.
3.5%.
We need 3.5% of the population.
I really want one of those, like, when you're doing like a fundraiser, like United Way. They always have the like temperature, and we're like, hey everybody, listen, we're not even going for 50%.
Yeah.
Like, so how many? We're 4. Okay.
I'm like, I need people to start raising their hands.
Yes, exactly.
Raise your hands.
3.5.
Come here, we're pledging. Pledge time.
It's still a lot of people in America. It's still a lot of people.
Right,
it's
right,
9 or
right.
10 million people. And it's not a magic formula, you know what I mean? But what we do know is that it takes a minority.
Right.
So when you're looking at that spectrum and you say, okay, listen, I don't want to have to show you pictures of black lynchings for you to get it. And it shouldn't take that, But that will wake up some people, I think that what we have to really, because what I hear underneath your question, I think, is the question of like, or it feels like those people who are on that neutral to active space might be in the minority. Is that it feels like we're in such a moment of backsliding, or if you can even call it that, that sometimes it feels like, where are all the people that really are about this? Right. And my friend Anisha wrote a book called The Marginalized Majority, where her case is that we are already a majority. Wow. The people who want social justice progress and racial justice progress, we actually are a majority. Right. We just need to act like it. Wow. And so this spectrum, I would say, don't waste your time arguing with the active opposers. I don't even know if you should waste your time with the passive opposers. I mean, if that's your thing, that's your thing. You know what I mean? If you feel energized to do it, somebody's got to talk to them.
Right. Someone's got to babysit. Someone's got to talk to them.
Somebody's got to do it.
And somebody has the energy for it.
Someone has the energy.
Or maybe it's a season. You do
Hello.
it for a season.
That's what I'm talking about.
And some people feel energized by doing that. Some people have no problem sitting down for coffee and be like, oh, Bob, you're so racist. Let's get you out of there. Let's patch you up and get you, some people are energized by that. But there are already enough of us that want this. The problem that we have is not, this is another thing I'd say, is that the bridges that we need to build are among our allies. Totally. Those are the bridges that need building.
As I think about the civil rights movement in this context, I feel like it's making clear this stratification because the civil rights leaders weren't trying to change the hearts and minds, right, of those who are racist. In fact, they needed them to not change, right? They needed them to react, right? They needed that hatred to show up on TV screens, right, in order to get to the people who are still being passive, but believed in the moral, underpinnings of what was happening. So this is actually very, very helpful.
Remember Dr. King keeps saying people of goodwill. We're calling out to people of goodwill. He's trying to call the allies into the fray. Now King was not against, winning over the oppressor. Like he's got this one message, oh my gosh, I think it's let my people go. 1962, let my people go. And this is early King, so he's very much influenced by Gandhi at the time. And Gandhi talks about nonviolence as actually winning over your enemy. Like at the end of the day, that person becomes your friend.
I can hear undertones of that in some of King's stuff, for sure.
Which happened with Gandhi. He wins over the British viceroy, and like they have this love-hate relationship where like, the viceroy hates Gandhi on one hand because he makes his job hard, but he has a lot of respect for him because you should read the letter that Gandhi writes to the British viceroy. It's very polite. It's like, dear sir, you're an oppressive asshole. And
Sincerely yours.
I really don't want to have to do this. But I mean, you're giving me no choice. And so King actually preaches that about the beloved community, that they'll be sitting and they'll sup with their enemies afterward. So he's not opposed to it. But like you said, the hearts and minds that he's trying to change are those who are sitting there and can get it.
Right.
Like he says in the beginning of his letter from the Birmingham jail, he goes, I don't sit around and argue with critics all the time. If I did that, I wouldn't have time to do anything else.
I also feel like King's proximity to power, to presidents, mattered a lot. And so I often wonder where he would have put folks, right? Because this is what gets so hard is when you do know the CEO, when you do know the congressperson and they're a good person or they're trying or, I know their policy doesn't fit what their principle is, but they really do have this principle, right? I feel like King was always strategizing around that. Like whether you're a good person or not is irrelevant to my life. What I need you to do is sign this bill.
Exactly.
Or I'm gonna march through this city again, or through this region again. I'm gonna march through Skokie. I'm gonna march,
Well, I love that you're putting those two things together because that's exactly what it is. Where Daniel Hunter and others have put together, that there are advocates in movement work, and those are the folks that have that proximity to power, or that work within the system to change it. I think the NAACP was that part of the civil rights movement. They're working to change the laws and policies. And you have the rebels and the organizers who are organizing outside of those established channels. And King is an interesting figure in the civil rights movement because there's this part in Parting the Waters, that trilogy about the civil rights movement, where he has this conversation, I think it was with RFK. And he's being very, just like you said, listen, like this is the deal, we need to do this. And he feels bad about it. He calls them back to apologize for that he might have been too harsh. We all can't be Dr. King.
I mean, I tell Jenny all the time that it makes me really upset when I actually like white people. Because it would be so much easier if I just didn't like you. Like, why do you have to be so damn likable?
I hear that.
If you're gonna be likable, can you at least be active on my side? Stop being likable and passive.
But I think it's like that need that, and I think King talked about this too, about our humanity we're all intertwined with one another. And so it is that balance. And I think I think King did it well, but I think it's a hard balance to stay in the space of, even at your worst and all of the things that you're doing to actively try to create this system of oppression, I can still recognize the humanity in you and understand that you are also hurting yourself as you do this. Because if we're not, whenever you refuse to see the humanity in another person, you diminish your own humanity at the same time. So I think, and it's hard. It is a hard balance. Like I try that, and it is, and I think that's where you kind of get into the more spiritual, the soul work of things, of trying to understand that. But it's like you have to hold both. Like, we're going to keep moving forward to make sure that we all have, rights so that we can thrive. But also, how do I still see that you are also a human being worthy of thriving too, but not at my expense, And that's that's the tension and the journey.
That takes a lot of energy.
It does. Yeah. I mean, but I think, I do think though that we have to figure out what that balance is, because otherwise then we start to perpetuate like the same thing.
Totally.
Which is
You're
what a lot of
pulling the
people
same-
get.
yes.
Like, so I do a lot of like, diversity, equity, inclusion work, and I've done that in some different organizations. And the thing people always come back to is like, if we're creating a space for people of color to do better, what about me? What am I
saying
left
that?
with?
The
With white
white
people.
people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, am I going to suffer that? Is it just going
That's the
to
only way
flip
they can
over?
see the paradigm.
Yeah.
Yes.
And first of all, it's like, okay, you have to realize what you're even saying right now. Like, like, how does that, like, do you realize how wrong that is? Let's start there.
Right.
But then also, we have to talk about the fact that white supremacy lives in the scarcity mindset.
Exactly.
That is like, if
Exactly.
I have this, it means you don't have this, and
Exactly.
vice versa. And if you have this, and I don't have that. But we're really moving into this, what we're talking about is abundance, believing that there is enough for everyone.
Yes.
And so, but it's a hard mindset to come out of from, living in this scarcity. But I have also seen people of color live in that same mindset. Like, you have the one Black woman at the top of the organization.
Right.
And it's like, well, there can't be another one because then there won't, and that's what they want us to do, so that, we don't all thrive in that. Yeah. But I think it's like a relearning or unlearning that, and relearning a different way of leading, a different way of existing. Yeah. I think the movement teaches us that, like what you were talking about. I love the community aspect of it, because it's not about one person, and a lot of times we elevate like King and all that, but all of the other people that were doing this work day in and day out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And not even just the people you can name that are around here,
So
because you
many
can go through Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Joanne Robinson and Bernard Lafayette and Bayard Rustin and all of these other. You can go through all the names.
They're the famous ones.
But remember,
Again,
there were thousands of people meeting every night at church to talk about to talk about how they could get free. And so there is this communal aspect of it, and our caring for the person next to us wherever we are, in whatever space we are. We look at, how can I, who am I, who's behind me? Like, who am I helping, And I constantly think about this, even recognizing my own privilege and where I am. And I'm like, okay, am I living as though I got here on my own? Or am I living as though, like, I know I'm standing on the shoulders of so many people who've helped me to get here, and then what am I doing about that? I don't get to just exist in this space on my own. That does not, I don't get to do that. I have to always be aware. And yes, it's harder work, but that's the work I think that we're called to. Otherwise, it's like, we're going to be, regardless of who's in power, we're still going to have the same issues. And that's not, to me, that's not success, what we're hoping. I have a friend who our constant conflict is around nonviolent struggle versus armed struggle. And so we're always talking about this. And one day she asked me, well, Andre, what do we do with all of the oppressors if we win nonviolently? Because in an armed struggle, you've killed everyone.
How do we dispose of the bodies is the only... That's the question.
Where are they being buried?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to smell them. Sorry.
And this tension is very real. I never want for Black people to feel like they are obligated to love people who actively work against their freedom. I don't believe you're obligated to do. I think that rage and frustration and sometimes even hatred is understandable. Even if it's not even
maybe even healthy.
It's a natural response to some of these things. It's not something that I would say you need to cultivate. But I could look at you and understand how you got there, right? But what do you do? Because if you do this in a nonviolent way, you're saying that those people will still be around, right? Now Sharp says for the dictator, they all face an ultimatum eventually, which is you kill everyone or leave, right? You can't govern the place. And the way that they usually try to is through violence and try to get everyone to submit. So they have to leave. So the only decision that person has to make is what airline would they like to take into exile? Where would they like to spend the rest of their day?
How do you spell your name? So
Yeah. But for everybody else, and I think that is partly why, those who are kind of in the principled nonviolence camp, like King and Gandhi and others, that they're onto something about grace, forgiveness, reconciliation. None of that can happen without justice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We do have to also not forget, because then otherwise we're not going to be able to create a new world.
Well, I think that's what's helpful for me, is to start with my imagination and the world that I'm trying to build, but holding myself to it, right? Which is where a lot of, quite frankly, nonprofit justice-y organizations go wrong, is that they're seeking a justice that they're not willing to live into themselves.
Wow. Yes,
Right.
exactly. That's great for you.
Right.
I'll be over here continuing life as usual. Yeah.
And so...
Well, this is imagination is so important to this, and it sounds cheesy, I think, to some people, but it's really the first thing is the vision of tomorrow.
Yeah.
What is the world that you want to build?
Yes.
Because that's where you're going to plan from, right? And without it, and this is what we're talking about with the babysitters and the carpoolers, that you are literally envisioning other systems, right?
Exactly.
How are you going to abolish the police if you don't imagine how you're going to handle it when people hurt one another and crimes are committed? How are you going to abolish prisons if you can't imagine how you'll rehabilitate people? It's so important for us to begin imagining these other ways of being and other ways of relating. Because again, you cannot resist a system that you are dependent upon.
I think that's what drew me into the conversation and into anti-racism work, is the watching people that I saw could have reacted and were warranted to react a certain way, and watching them choose to react differently was I feel like I fell in love with Blackness, and I fell in love with a different way of being. And I think that's really powerful. And I think there's a lot of people that think you do this work because it's quote, the right thing to do, and not recognizing this is going to open you up into a whole world that you didn't even know is already existing. We don't just have to imagine a world that's never been. You can go back and see these things and draw from that to imagine both, a better future by looking at what's happened in the past as well. And I think there's something really powerful about that, about recognizing it's not going to be just a scarcity mindset, that it's just going to be flipped upturned. He's not just talking about Jesus wasn't just talking about upside down, and now those that were on the bottom were now on the top and they're rolling oppressively. That's not what we're talking about. It's a paradigm shift. And I don't think that's what enough people get swept into. And I have a quote that I love, and I'm going to try to say this person's name right, but the role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible. And Tony Cade Bambara, I hope I'm saying that right, says that. Those are the types of revolution. I want to be swept into there has to be, it can't be this way. There has to be a way forward. And I know you're an artist and you're an activist, and I what are the things that you get swept up in, or how do you see the arts kind of joining with revolution in making it this people being I have no choice, I'm just how do we get them to that final tip?
Yeah, so much to say about this. First, have you heard of laughtivism?
I feel like I have.
This is This is a phrase coined by Srđan Popović, who I mentioned earlier, who led the Serbian Revolution. And so I actually got to interview Srđan for my podcast the other day. Oh, wow. And we were talking about this. And I said, how did y'all even learn to organize? And he was like, we just started trying different pranks and pranks.
Stop it.
We just started trying different pranks, and we learned what worked as we went along. Wow. Now, Serja was a bass player in a rock band when he started this group.
Okay.
And never imagined himself being an activist or because he thought politics were boring. You know, and so
As an artist would.
right. But one day he saw a flatbed truck speeding by him, and on the back was a rock band. And they were singing songs about the regime. And they said, if we are busy fighting the war, when will we have time to have sex?
Stop it.
Oh, that's so great.
And that inspired him.
That's
Wow.
And he realized that to fight the power,
Yes.
he did not have
Yes.
to become a politician or put on a suit or go get a degree in political science. And so the Serbian Revolution really incorporated a lot of creativity. That really inspired me in some ways, like reading about this particular revolution. And thinking, you know, the civil rights movement, they had songs and all this kind of stuff. All this,
That we still sing.
yes, right? So it's always a part, but I began to realize that when I looked at all these people that I respected, all of them were artistic people. They were all creative people. Like I mentioned, Serja was a bass player, but Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, they could sing. They were singers, you know? Gandhi talks about how this poem and this play inspired his work. Václav Havel, who became the president of, mind blanking, he's a high dignitary. He was a poet, and he was a playwright. And his plays were so subversive that he was arrested and put in prison under the regime. He came out and became president. You know, it's like the arts are already a part of this. You know, it's already a part. And when we're talking about this, think about the things that we're talking about, right? We're talking about imagining different ways of organizing things. We're talking about creativity, you know, so it makes sense that people who are using an artistic lens, doing artistic work, are leading in justice work because it's the mode that you are, in order to, what is the status quo? It's a box. Right. It's boundaries, it confines, and it's a dominant culture, and it says things have to go this way in order for it to function.
That's right.
In order for you to change it, what do you have to do? You have to think outside of that box, right? You have to innovate. And so, for me, that is like where the arts and justice and creativity and imagination, it's all in there together. And I used to think that it was very cheesy to talk about imagination, but I've begun to realize that it's not an empty thing. It's not just cliche, but literally people keep on going with things the way that they are because they literally cannot imagine anything else. And so, you know, the folks like Adrienne Marie Brown who are writing speculative fiction about the future, Afrofuturist visions of the of the future. And she has a collection called Octavia's Brood of different activists that have written speculative fiction that drives our justice work. You know, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote speculative fiction too.
I did not know that.
He wrote a story about an apocalyptic event that only left a black man and a white woman alive.
Wow.
Okay.
And they go traveling through the country, and you know, obviously, there's this, they see each other's humanity. She sees his humanity. And then at the end, they find out they're not the only ones left.
Wow.
Right? But these things have happened before. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, I know that we don't want an Uncle Tom as an epithet now.
Right.
But in that story, first off, Uncle Tom gives his life to save his own, to save other black people. But that, for many people at the time, that was their first encounter with a black person. And it did change some people's minds, So, the arts, I don't want to make it sound like the arts are only functional. Like you have to write about politics or sing about politics or paint something.
We need somebody to sing about sex too.
Yeah, exactly. But it can be functional in that way. But also we have to remember what this justice work is about, right? it's not about the fight in itself.
Right.
We're trying to get
Oh,
somewhere.
I love
We're
that.
trying to get to something. And
Yes.
so, I've mentioned I've been interviewing other folks. You know, it's a part of my own journey. Like all of this stuff comes out of my journey of, you know, seeing Philando Castile die and pulling a stone around Los Angeles to protest racism, which I didn't realize later on I was doing performance art and doing that. And going on this search of how do societies change. So part of the interviews, I talked with Adrienne Marie Brown, and she turned it on me. She's the only interview that ever just said, "What do you think, Andre?" Right? And when we were talking about this, about pleasure activism, her new book, and I said, well, you know, I grew up in church, and the thing that stands out to me is the story of the Garden of Eden. I wish someone would have told me this, but no one did. But the word Eden is a Hebrew word for pleasure, the Hebrew word for bliss. And in the ancient Near East, there was a tradition that people believed that gods owned gardens. It was their garden for them to live in and to recline and to enjoy. So there's this whole school of thought that Genesis 1 is written in the form of a temple hymn. I think a lot of people are hearing that now, and the construction of a divine temple. And usually gardens are adjacent to the temple, and in Genesis 2 you have a garden. It's God's garden to enjoy. But God gives that garden to the humans. You may eat of any of the trees in the garden, except one. I think that if that story, that creation narrative is supposed to be telling us something about the kind of world that God wanted and the kind of lives that God wanted human beings to live, that it was ultimately about bliss, delight, pleasure. We fight for justice because everyone deserves to eat from the trees in the garden.
I love that.
Right? That's why we fight for justice. And when we're talking about justice, we're talking about people being able to access that life that God created them to live. You got to think about this too. If the garden belongs to God, if it's God's to enjoy, that means that it's God's prerogative to be there and to eat. But God shares that with us, which this is what Peter's talking about when it talks about being partakers of the divine nature, that God actually wants for us to enjoy to some degree the type of life that God enjoys. And so when we're fighting for justice, we're saying, no, these people are not just created in the image of God and deserve and worthy of respect. They were made to partake of the life of God, which includes enjoyment and rest and delight and pleasure. And so we need to knock down these walls so that they can get in. And with us writing songs and plays and all this kind of stuff about that life that we were always intended to live, first off, that's worship. And second, it's our birthright. And so, you know, we need that too. Otherwise, you know, like Howard Zinn writes about this story where he brought a string quartet into his class to play one day because he said political conversation can sour you. We need a little music.
Wow, I love that.
That's so beautiful.
Do you ever struggle with guilt as an artist? Because I feel this way all the time, where I'm like, all I'm doing is writing, right? I'm not leading a movement. I'm not going to meetings. I'm not, you know what I mean? Like, all I do is write. I just sit at home and I write. And do you ever struggle with that?
Yes. Well, first off, you're writing about the stuff. So, like...
So I always have James Baldwin in my head, because James Baldwin was like this too. He was like, he refused to let people call him an activist, because he was like, I'm a writer. Like there's people putting their lives on the line, right? And he's like, maybe in some ways, right? Maybe the FBI has a file on me, right? But not in the same way, right? Not putting my life on the line in the same way.
But I think that, again, like the person who says, I'll watch your kids while you go to the march is a part of the movement, you know? And they're just as much as part of the movement as the person who went to the march. Because at the end of the day, actually the person wouldn't have gone to the march if they didn't do that. And so someone read, white people can be exhausting. And they thought to themselves, am I exhausting? You know? And now they're different, you know? But I do struggle with this sometimes in thinking that, you know, every song has to be like a fight the power song, And then I realized, though, is that, like I was just talking about with the garden, is that I'm exhausted. I am so tired, but I can't stop. If I could stop and just be a raging capitalist, I probably would, and just be like, listen, what that got to do with me, and just like be an Instagram influencer or something. I'd probably do it.
Like free stuff,
right? Hashtag sponsored.
But I can't, and so I realized that people who care, people who are doing this work, all this kind of stuff, they need a break.
Yeah. Yep.
And so when I make a song that is about sitting out on the porch and enjoying a glass of wine. Well, somebody who's fighting knows exactly what to do with that song. They about to go sit on their porch and have a glass of wine.
And will maybe enjoy it more than the person who does that every night as part of a routine. Right.
They have permission to.
Yes. That it's a gift.
Yes.
We need it. And that's why I think that it's so important for us to aim through the target and remember why we do the work that we do. Because hopefully there will come a day where this work will be obsolete.
Yes. And all there will be is pleasure.
Right.
Stop it.
Let's get the 3.5%. Where are we at?
We don't know how to address the fact that this stuff is still in the air. People tell the story like Dr. King preached the I Have a Dream speech and then ascended into heaven.
Especially in anti-racism work, I say Black women are 100% experts regardless.
I'm deeply invested in building movements where folks aren't shamed for not coming out of the womb, understanding cis heteropatriarchal violence.
Prison isn't addressing trauma, it's not addressing violence. Prison is a place of trauma and violence.
Everything in the news is just like beating us down. I want to see stories about Black women succeeding and thriving.
Black folks in a white space.
Listen, you fight each other.
You may not have shit else in common, but you're gonna be friends, right? I love all the warm-up questions. I really. I was like, hell, we're here.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for watching The Next Question. We hope that you enjoyed it. A special thank you to all of our backers who made all of this possible. We hope that you'll continue the conversation with us. You can check out our website, join in on our conversation on social media, as well as signing up for homework where you can get a reading list and questions to help you dive deeper. Special thank you to Andre Henry, our amazing guest. If you're interested in learning more about him, check out his podcast called Hope and Hard Pills, where I'm sure he'll be dropping a ton more wisdom for you. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.